My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old, and my father secretly filed a fraudulent directorship amendment removing my name from our company's federal registry and inserting my brother as sole executive authority while I was overseas on a special federal assignment. And I did not find out the way most people find out about the kind of betrayal that comes from inside your own blood, which is through a confrontation, or a confession, or a document left carelessly where it should not have been left. I found out on a Monday morning at my desk at exactly 9:22 a.m. while working through the backlog queue that had accumulated on my high security terminal during the 3 weeks I had been away, and I was drinking nothing because I had not yet had time to make anything, and the overhead lighting in the registry operations room was the same cold, white it always is, and my terminal was showing the offshore corporate directorship amendment queue, and I was moving through it the way I always move through it, which is methodically and without assumption, and without the expectation that anything in the queue is going to be personally relevant to me, because in 3 years of working at the offshore corporate, shell, and business registry authority, nothing in the queue has ever been personally relevant to me. Until this morning, I work as a senior verification officer at the offshore corporate shell and business registry authority, and my professional function is to review and authenticate every directorship amendment filing that passes through the authority's federal registry for offshore holding companies operating across all 39 affiliated international financial jurisdictions. And what that means in operational terms is that no directorship change and no executive authority transfer and no founding charter amendment on any offshore holding company registered within our network becomes legally binding until it has passed through my terminal and received a senior officer authentication stamp. And I have been the senior officer responsible for this function for 3 years. And before that, I spent 4 years as a junior verification analyst in the same division. And I know this system the way, something you have spent 7 years inside of, which is completely and without the need to look anything up. I returned from my federal overseas assignment on Sunday evening, and I was at my desk by 8:50 a.m. on Monday. And my backlog queue contained 47 pending directorship amendment filings that had accumulated during my 3-week absence, and they had been held in the pending authentication layer by the system's automatic senior clearance requirement protocol, which means that nothing in that queue had been processed or approved or rejected while I was away. And I began working through the queue from the oldest filing to the most recent the way the authority's processing guidelines require. And the first 11 filings were routine, and I authenticated them and moved on. And the 12th filing was flagged with a preliminary system alert in amber, which usually indicates a minor biometric inconsistency in the supporting documentation. And I opened it and cleared the inconsistency and authenticated it and moved on. And I was on filing number 19 when I stopped moving. The company name on filing number 19 was a name I recognized immediately, and without any need to cross-reference my memory against any external record. Because the name on filing number 19 is a name I have known since I was old enough to understand what a company was, and what it meant for a family to build one. And the name belongs to the offshore holding company that my father established 17 years ago, and that I joined as a junior operational partner at the age of 22, and that I was formally registered as a founding co-director of at the age of 26, when my father stood across a legal desk from me and told me that the company was as much mine as it was his, and that my name on the charter meant something permanent, and I believed him because he was my father, and the charter was a legal document, and I had no reason at that point in my life to understand that a legal document is only as permanent as the integrity of the people who hold copies of it. The filing was a directorship amendment. Submission, and it had been submitted 17 days ago while I was in the second week of my overseas assignment, and the amendment requested the complete removal of my name from the founding co-director register and the insertion of my brother's name as sole CEO and sole executive authority of the entire holding company structure. And my brother is 28 years old, and he has never held a professional position of any duration. And he has no formal qualifications in corporate governance or financial administration. And his name has never appeared on any document connected to this company in any professional capacity in 17 years. And his name was now at the top of the executive authority register, where my name had been for 6 years. I thought about my father telling me 4 years ago that I was the backbone of the company. And I thought about the specific word he used, which was backbone. And I thought about the way he said it, which was with the particular warmth that a person uses when they are describing something they value. And I thought about how backbone is a word that means the thing that holds everything upright. And I thought about how you can remove a backbone from something and insert a different structure, and the thing will collapse. And I thought about all of that for a measured period of time, and then I looked back at my terminal, and I looked at the automated preliminary status code that the system had already assigned to filing number 19 before I had opened it. And the code was not amber, and it was not green. And it was a full-level, one-shell fraud detection flag generated automatically by the system's founding charter biometric verification engine. Because the signatures submitted with the amendment did not align with the original charter signature profiles on record, and the system had known something was wrong before I did, and it had waited for me, and I reached for my senior administrator confirmation keycard, and I held it flat in my right hand, and I entered my clearance code into the terminal without any change in my breathing or my posture or my expression, and at 9:40 a.m., the Global Operating License Suspension Protocol, activated across all 39 affiliated international jurisdictions simultaneously, and the cross-border freeze notification went out to every offshore banking institution linked to the holding company's registered financial channels. And my father's empire was administratively dead before his morning meeting had started, and I had not made a single phone call. It was 2:15 p.m. on Monday afternoon, and I was still at my desk in the Central Corporate Clearance and Monitoring Room. And the room was the same temperature it is always, which is slightly cooler than comfortable, because the server infrastructure that runs the global compliance grid generates heat, and the climate control system compensates by keeping the air in the room at a level that makes you feel like you are working inside something precise. And I was at my terminal, and the global corporate compliance grid was open on my primary screen. And I was monitoring it the way I always monitor it after a major suspension event, which is with complete attention and no visible reaction to anything the screen produces, because the screen is going to produce a great deal over the hours following a level 1 shell fraud detection flag. And I had been through this process before with other companies and other directors and other fraudulent amendment filings, and the process is always the same, which is that the automated system expands its reach methodically and without hurry into every connected financial and administrative layer attached to the flagged entity, and it does this without requiring my instruction and without requiring my emotion. And I was present to observe and authenticate, and nothing more. The compliance grid was showing the progressive international response to the morning's suspension event, and by 2:15 p.m., the 39 affiliated jurisdictions had all confirmed receipt of the operating license suspension notice, and 26 of those jurisdictions had already updated their local corporate registries to reflect the suspended status of the holding company. And the remaining 13 were in various stages of administrative processing. And the system was tracking all of it in real time and producing a rolling log of confirmation timestamps. And I was reading the log the way I read all logs, which is completely and in order, and without skipping anything. At 2:49 p.m., the offshore banking compliance module showed that 4 of the 7 financial institutions linked to the holding company's registered accounts had completed their internal review of the cross-border freeze notification and had formally restricted all account access pending the outcome of the federal fraud investigation, and the remaining 3 institutions were within their standard processing window, and the system flagged them as pending and continued tracking. And I noted the 4 confirmations, and I returned to the rolling log. At 3:40 p.m., the compliance grid produced an alert ping. The ping was sourced to the International Departures Terminal at the airport, and it carried a corporate fraud travel interdiction code. And the name attached to the interdiction was my brother's. And what had happened was that my brother had arrived at the airport and had attempted to check in for a business class flight to Geneva, and the check-in system had processed his passport against the global corporate fraud registry that the morning suspension event had written his fraudulently registered executive identity into, and the check-in barrier had not opened. And the screen at the counter had displayed a Level 1 corporate fraud ban code in red text. And within 6 minutes of the initial ping, the compliance grid showed a secondary alert, which was an airport border security detainment log indicating that my brother had been escorted by border officers to a secondary validation room for identity and credentials review. And the log described the detainment reason as suspected fraudulent executive registration. And I read that description, and I read the timestamp, and I returned to the rolling log. At 3:55 p.m., the asset freeze module that had been initialized as part of the cross-border protocol that morning reached the corporate credit account layer, and the terminal showed a notification that the linked corporate credit cards registered under my father's primary account credentials had been automatically declined at the airport terminal counter, and I noted the time of the decline, and I noted the location code attached to the decline event. And I returned to the compliance grid. At 4:01 p.m., my personal mobile phone lit up on the left side of my desk. It was my mother. I placed the phone face down on the desk surface. It lit up again at 4:04, and again at 4:07, and again at 4:10, and again at 4:14, and again at 4:19. And I watched the screen pulse against the desk surface 6 times across 20 minutes, and I did not pick it up, and I did not turn it over, and the feeling I might have expected to feel, which is the pull of a mother's voice calling across a line toward a daughter who still wants to answer, did not arrive. And it did not arrive because that pull requires a foundation of good faith, and good faith requires a history of honesty. And I had opened filing number 19 at 9:22 a.m., and I knew exactly what the history contained. While the phone was still producing light against the desk surface, I was watching the compliance grid show the automated audit loop extending its reach beyond the corporate accounts and into the personal financial layer attached to my parents' joint residential profile. And the system had identified my parents' joint home equity account and their registered retirement fund as assets connected to the fraudulent directorship filing through the founding charter ownership chain, and had issued a federal hold notification to the relevant financial institutions. And the hold was not something I had requested, and it was not something I had typed an instruction to produce, and it was the system doing what the system was built to do when it finds a Level 1 shell fraud event attached to a founding charter. And I watched the hold confirmations arrive in the log one after the other, and I felt the particular quality of silence that comes from watching something very large move exactly as it was designed to move. On Tuesday morning, I arrived at my desk at 8:44 a.m., and I made tea, and I sat down and I opened my terminal. and the overnight escalation notification was the first thing the system presented to me. And the notification stated that the Global Offshore Corporate Shell and Business Registry Authority's Federal Investigations Division had completed its overnight review of the automated fraud report and had officially opened a full criminal corporate identity theft investigation and had assigned the case a permanent federal tracking number valid across all 39 affiliated international jurisdictions and had issued formal suspension notices to every professional licensing body connected to my brother's fraudulently registered executive profile. And I read the escalation notification from the first line to the last line, and then I picked up my tea and I took a slow sip and I opened the morning queue. It was Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting inside the International Document Forensics and Registry Division on the 10th floor, which is 2 floors above my standard workstation, and the room is accessed through a biometric double-door system that requires both a fingerprint scan and a retinal confirmation. And I had cleared both at 11:40 a.m. when the Bureau's Federal Investigations Coordinator had granted me temporary elevated observation access because the criminal corporate identity theft file required a senior verification officer to be present during the evidence assembly process, and I was the senior verification officer assigned to this case. And I had been sitting at the forensic observation terminal since noon, and the room around me was smaller than the operations floor, and the air was drier, and the screens in this room are larger than standard issue because the forensic analysts need to display multiple document layers simultaneously. And I was watching those screens, and my hands were flat on the desk in front of me, and my expression was the expression I bring to every evidence assembly session, which is no expression at all. The forensic team had submitted an automated retrieval request to the authority's own source registry server at 9 a.m. on Tuesday. And the retrieval request had pulled every version of every document ever filed under the holding company's registration number, including the original founding charter from 17 years ago, and every subsequent amendment and every directorship confirmation and every biometric signature log attached to any filing action ever performed on the company's federal record, and by 1:40 p.m., the full document package had been extracted from the source server and loaded into the Forensic Division's evidence archive, and the senior forensic analyst had begun the layer-by-layer comparison process, and I was sitting beside him watching the comparison run on the large format screen. What the forensic system did first was isolate my electronic directorship signature token, which is a unique cryptographic identifier, generated at the point of my original co-director registration 6 years ago, and which is the digital equivalent of a handwritten signature in the context of the authority's federal registry. And the system compared every instance of that token appearing in the company's filing history against the token submitted with the fraudulent amendment that had entered my queue as filing number 19. And the comparison took 4 minutes and 31 seconds. And when it completed, the system had identified that the token used in the fraudulent amendment was a corrupted digital copy of my original token, and that the corruption had been introduced by extracting the token string from an earlier legitimate filing and redeploying it without the dynamic timestamp verification layer that the authority's system generates fresh for every new filing action. And the absence of that timestamp layer was the primary trigger for the Level 1 shell fraud flag the system had generated automatically on Monday morning. And the forensic analyst entered a confirmation code, and the system logged the corrupted token as primary evidence. Item 1, and absorbed it into the federal case file. And I watched it do this, and I noted the time. At 2:03 p.m., the forensic system pulled the administrative login records attached to the company's federal registry profile, and the login records show every instance of any person accessing the company's registry account through the authority's secure portal. And the records showed that 17 days ago at 11:14 p.m. a login had been made to the company's registry account from an unregistered device, and the login had used my father's primary access credentials and had remained active for 1 hour and 47 minutes. And during that session, the directorship amendment had been drafted and submitted, and the forensic system cross-referenced the session activity log against the authority's standard amendment filing procedure, and identified that during the session, a digital file containing my original co-director registration document had been opened, and my electronic signature token had been extracted from it, using a third-party document editing application that left a software fingerprint in the file's metadata, and the system logged the software fingerprint as primary evidence item 2. And I read the log entry, and I returned to the screen. At 2:38 p.m., my office assistant sent me an internal message informing me that my father had called my office direct line 5 times since noon, and that the calls had been made from his registered personal mobile number, and that the most recent call had lasted 8 seconds and had not produced a coherent message, and I typed back a single instruction, which was to route all incoming contact from every number registered to any member of my immediate family to the standard 30-day administrative review portal, and to confirm the routing to each caller with the automated acknowledgement message, and nothing further, and my assistant confirmed the routing within 90 seconds, and after that, my father's calls became a matter for the portal and not for me. At 3:17 p.m., the registry login audit produced a secondary automated data drop into the case file, and a notification came to my observation terminal, and I opened it, and the data drop contained the access records for the company's primary offshore banking portal. And the records showed that 17 days ago at 2:44 p.m., my brother had logged into the banking portal using his own registered credentials and had successfully changed the primary security authentication pins on 4 of the company's 7 linked accounts. And the timestamp of my brother's banking portal session was 3 hours and 30 minutes after the close of my father's registry session on the same day, and the sequence of those 2 sessions logged against the same calendar date destroyed any possibility of characterizing the amendment as an administrative error or a system anomaly or a misunderstanding of any kind, and the forensic system logged the banking portal session records as primary evidence, item 3 and 4, and I noted the addition, and I closed the notification. At 4:19 p.m., the home communications server attached to the case file recorded an incoming voicemail from my brother and routed a transcript to my observation terminal as part of the standard evidence capture protocol, and the transcript described the audio as a distressed personal communication. And my brother's message stated that the corporate fraud flag attached to his fraudulently registered executive identity had now propagated across every professional licensing database in the 39 affiliated jurisdictions, and that he had received automated rejection responses from 2 financial institutions where he had attempted to open personal business accounts, and that his name was appearing on the global directorship blacklist that professional background screening services use when evaluating candidates for board positions and executive roles. And that he believed the blacklisting was irreversible, and the transcript ran for 3 minutes and 52 seconds, and I read it from the first word to the last word, and I felt nothing that required me to change my posture or my expression. And I closed the transcript, and I looked back at the forensic screen. At 5 p.m., the Forensic Division's automated case packaging system completed its assembly of the full corporate fraud and identity theft evidence file. And I watched my observation terminal display the live transmission confirmation as the Bureau sent the complete case file to the federal prosecutor's wing. And the transmission log listed 51 individual evidence items, and the case status field updated from active federal investigation to prosecutorial review, and the system generated a permanent prosecution reference number and distributed it across all 39 affiliated jurisdictions. And I sat with my hands flat on the desk, and I watched the confirmation screen complete its cycle, and the gears of the federal machine were turning, and they were not going to stop, and I had not raised my voice once. It was Wednesday morning, and I had arrived at the International Corporate Clearance and Registry Bureau headquarters at 8:37 a.m. And I had walked through the main lobby the way I walk through it every morning, which is with my senior verification lanyard displayed flat against my chest, and my administrator keycard already separated from my bag and held in my left hand, and my pace measured and my eyes forward. And the lobby of this building is a large and deliberately unwelcoming space, and it was designed to communicate to anyone entering it for the first time that this is not a building that makes accommodations for the emotional state of the person walking through it. And the floor is pale composite stone, and it reflects the overhead lighting in a way that makes the space feel even larger than it is. And the ceiling runs high above the entry level. And along the center of the lobby floor, there is a row of 12 automated biometric turnstile units, each approximately chest height and made of brushed steel, and each one connected directly to the Bureau's Federal Identity and Corporate Fraud Registry, and each one capable of reading a presented credential against that registry in under 2 seconds, and each one capable of stopping a person completely in under 2 seconds. And I had cleared turnstile 7 with my administrator keycard at 8:39 a.m., and I had taken the staff elevator to the 8th floor, and I had been at my workstation since 8:44 a.m. The live security feed panel was open on my secondary terminal screen as part of my standard monitoring protocol for active federal cases, and the case attached to the holding company fraud file meant that my father's registered identity and my brother's registered identity were both flagged on the Bureau's proximity alert system, and the system was designed to notify me if either of those identities appeared in the building's entry processing log and at 9:04 a.m. The proximity alert produced a notification on my secondary screen, and I opened the lobby feed. They came in through the main entrance at 9:04 a.m., and there were 4 of them, and my father was at the front, and my brother was beside him. And behind them were 2 individuals carrying structured leather briefcases and wearing dark suits, and the suits belonged to private defense lawyers. And I could identify that from the feed without audio because of the way those 2 individuals moved, which was with the particular forward momentum of people who had been given a version of events on the way over and believed that version was going to be sufficient. And my father was carrying a thick manila folder pressed against the left side of his body, and his jaw was set. And my brother was wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, and was walking with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told by a lawyer that morning to present themselves in a composed manner and was finding that instruction difficult to maintain. They crossed the lobby floor toward the reception desk, and my father spoke to the reception officer, and the conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds, and the reception officer maintained the standard professional stillness that Bureau reception staff are trained to maintain when visitors arrive in a state of controlled agitation, and at 9:08 a.m., my brother separated from the group and moved toward the visitor access turnstile on the left side of the lobby, and he produced a guest identification card and held it against the reader panel, and the reader processed the card in under 2 seconds, and the turnstile did not open, and the screen above the reader displayed a Level 1 identity theft marker in red, and the entry token was blocked automatically because the Bureau's credential verification system had cross-referenced the card's registered identity against the active federal fraud investigation log the moment the card touched the reader, and the match had been immediate, and the turnstile had responded accordingly. And my brother stepped back and looked at the screen, and then looked at the turnstile, and then looked back at the screen, and the screen continued to display the red marker without any intention of changing. She called Mom. Mom called the clinic is something my mother had described to me once as the way our family moved information upward when something went wrong, which was that the person who discovered the problem called my mother, and my mother called whoever in the family held the most authority over the situation, and the problem was passed upward until it reached the person who could resolve it. And I had spent my entire childhood being the person in that chain who was called upon to fix things quietly and efficiently and without acknowledgement. And I had spent my adult professional life building the kind of institutional authority that does not pass problems upward, because it is the top of the chain. And I was sitting on the 8th floor, watching my brother stare at a red screen on a turnstile and understanding that the chain had nowhere left to go. My father turned from the reception desk toward the security officer stationed beside the turnstile bank, and he placed his folder on the surface of the security counter, and he began speaking. And the feed carries no audio to my floor, but the folder came open and documents were lifted from it and held toward the security officer, and the security officer did not take them. And my father's free hand was moving in the way that hands move when the voice attached to them is escalating. And at 9:13 a.m., a second security officer moved from the far side of the lobby to a position beside the first, and my father continued speaking, and the folder continued to produce documents. And at one point, my father pointed toward the upper floors of the building, and I watched him point, and I understood what the gesture meant, and I felt nothing about it. The doctor's reveal arrived at 9:17 a.m. in the form of Dr. Evelyn Vance, the Bureau's chief enforcement validator, who came through the internal security door at the rear of the reception suite, accompanied by 2 armed security escorts, positioned one step behind her on either side, and she was carrying nothing because she had no need to carry anything. And she crossed the lobby floor to where the defense lawyers were standing, and she addressed the senior lawyer directly. And she spoke for approximately 45 seconds, and I could not hear what she said, but I watched the senior lawyer's posture complete the specific transition that a lawyer's posture makes when the information they are receiving is materially different from the information they were given by their client. And at 9:19 a.m., the senior lawyer said something to my father, and my father looked at the lawyer and then looked at the internal security door and then looked back at the lawyer, and Dr. Vance had already turned and was walking back toward the internal door, and the 2 security escorts had repositioned themselves on either side of the group, and one of them indicated the corridor that leads to the lower ground verification wing with a gesture that was professional and left no room for interpretation. My father and my brother and the 2 lawyers followed the gesture because there was no alternative to following it, and I watched the security feed track them through the lobby and into the lower ground corridor, and I watched the reinforced door at the corridor entrance register their passage and close behind them. And the lobby returned to its standard configuration, and the reception officer returned to the standard reception posture, and the turnstile bank continued its low mechanical operation, and I was sitting at my workstation on the 8th floor, and I turned back to my primary terminal, and I opened the morning processing queue, and I began to work. It was Wednesday morning at 11:15, and I was sitting in the high-backed director chair in my private compliance suite on the 8th floor, and the chair is constructed from dark leather and sits on a steel base that allows it to rotate with a resistance that is neither too loose nor too stiff. And it was positioned facing the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that runs the full width of the suite's exterior boundary. And from this position on a clear morning, the city extends in every direction below, and Wednesday morning was clear. And I had been sitting in this position since 11:08 a.m., and I was not reviewing documents, and I was not operating my terminal, and I was sitting with both hands resting in my lap and I was looking at the city the way you look at something that has no opinion about what is happening behind you. And the suite behind me was silent in the way that rooms with acoustic glass construction are always silent, which is not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of a space that has been specifically engineered to prevent the outside world from entering it. And I had requested this suite 3 years ago when I was appointed to the chief senior director position, and I had requested it because of the glass and because of the silence, and I had never once found either of them insufficient. At 11:09 a.m., I had instructed my assistant via the internal messaging system to proceed to the lower ground verification wing and escort the group upstairs using the executive elevator on the east corridor. And the executive elevator requires a senior clearance authorization code to operate from the lower ground level. And my assistant had been issued a single-use code valid for one ascent, and I had confirmed the instruction and returned to looking at the city. And I had been looking at the city for 6 minutes when I heard the executive elevator doors open at the end of the east corridor outside my suite. My assistant opened the suite door and held it against the frame, and they came in, and my father entered first, and my brother was beside him, and the 2 defense lawyers followed, and the suite door closed behind the last of them, and none of them could see my face because my chair was facing the glass wall, and what they could see was the back of a high-backed, dark leather director chair, and a large desk of black composite material and a matte black compliance folder sitting closed and precisely centered on the desk surface and floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides of the room, showing the city in every direction below. And the room was larger than people expect when they enter it for the first time, and the pale floor extends a considerable distance from the door to the desk, and I have never shortened that distance because the walk across it is informative. I waited. I counted to 5 in the particular internal way I count when I am waiting for something. And then I turned the chair around. My father saw me first, and the sequence of events that followed in his face took less than 2 seconds to complete. And what it contained was recognition, and then a specific recalibration of every assumption he had carried into the building that morning. And then something that was not quite an emotion and not quite a calculation, but existed in the space between them. And my brother saw me half a second after my father, and my brother's response was different from my father's. Because my brother had less practice at controlling his face, and what moved across my brother's face was unmediated and complete. And the specific quality of it was the quality of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was never ground at all. And the 2 lawyers looked at me and then looked at my father and then looked back at me and made the professional adjustment that lawyers make when the meeting they prepared for turns out to be a different meeting entirely. And I sat in my chair with both hands resting flat on the desk on either side of the compliance folder. And I looked at all 4 of them, and I said nothing. My father spoke first, and he spoke in the way he has always spoken when he is afraid, which is loudly and with the vocabulary of grievance. And he used the word family, and he used the word private, and he used the phrase internal misunderstanding, and he used the word unfair, and he said that this was not a matter for a government building. And he said that whatever had happened with the registry filing was a clerical situation that could be resolved between family members without federal involvement, and his voice moved around the room and the acoustic glass absorbed it and returned nothing to him. And I let him speak until the specific moment when his voice began to understand that the room was not going to respond to it, which took approximately 100 seconds. And then I opened the compliance folder I read from the biometric document forensics report, and I read the corrupted directorship token analysis, and I read the 17 metadata inconsistency markers, and I read the administrative login timestamp showing my father's registry session at 11:14 p.m. 17 days ago. And I read the banking portal session record showing my brother's security PIN changes at 2:44 p.m. on the same day. And I read the software fingerprint identification confirming the third-party editing application used to extract my electronic signature token from the original charter filing. And I read all of these things in the tone I use when I read evidence into any official record, which is level and clear and without inflection. And when I had finished reading, I closed the folder and I placed both hands on top of it, and I looked at my brother. I explained to my brother that the authorities' federal regulations contain no discretionary provision when it comes to corporate registry, fraud, and offshore directorship identity theft, and that the case file transmission to the federal prosecutor's wing had been completed at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, and that the transmission was a fully automated protocol event triggered by the evidence threshold being met, and that no person in this building or any other building had the individual authority to reverse a completed prosecution referral transmission, and that the asset liquidation schedule attached to a criminal prosecution referral of this classification is administered by the Federal Financial Enforcement Division on a timeline determined entirely by that division, and that the liquidation would proceed across every asset layer connected to the registered identities named in the case file, and that those identities included my father's personal financial profile and my brother's fraudulently registered executive profile, and every corporate and residential asset attached to either of them. I stopped speaking, and I put my hands flat on the desk. My father was standing in front of my desk, and he was not moving, and he was not speaking. And the folder of corporate printouts he had carried into the building that morning was nowhere visible, and my brother was standing beside him, and my brother's careful Wednesday morning composure had completed its dissolution sometime during the reading of the evidence report, and what remained in his posture was something that had no professional name. And the two lawyers were standing behind both of them. And the senior lawyer was looking at the middle distance in the way that lawyers look at the middle distance when they are rapidly reassessing the billable complexity of the situation they have walked into. And nobody in the room was producing sound. And the city continued below the glass on two sides, and it had no opinion about any of this. And my father and my brother were standing completely still in front of the desk of the daughter they had erased from a registry while she was overseas, serving the federal institution that had just processed everything they owned into a criminal evidence file. And the mercy of that daughter was the only remaining variable in their financial survival and their corporate future and their personal freedom. And I was the daughter, and I was sitting in the chair, and the chair was not moving. It was still Wednesday morning, and they were still standing in front of my desk, and I reached forward, and I opened my terminal, and I navigated to the official corporate registry fraud transmission portal, which is a secure federal interface that requires a senior director biometric scan and a dual administrator confirmation code before any prosecution document package can be formally dispatched to the Criminal Fraud Division. And I placed my right thumb on the biometric reader recessed into the right side of the terminal housing, and the reader processed my print in under 2 seconds and returned a green confirmation light. And I entered my dual administrator code using the keypad beside the reader, and the transmission interface opened, and the complete, unauthorized directorship amendment dissolution file was already assembled and loaded in the dispatch queue, because the Forensic Division's automated case packaging system had completed its work at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, and everything was already in order and waiting. And the file contained every piece of extracted evidence, including the corrupted directorship token analysis, and the 17 metadata, inconsistency markers, and the administrative login records, and the banking portal session, timestamps, and the software fingerprint identification, and the full 17 days of server identity, theft tracking logged against my original co-director registration, and I moved the cursor to the dispatch confirmation field, and I clicked it once, and the transmission progress bar appeared on the screen, and it completed in 9 seconds, and the screen returned a permanent prosecution lodgment reference number, and I did not write it down because it was already distributed across all 39 affiliated federal databases and would remain there on a basis that does not expire. I looked up at them. My father was watching the terminal screen, and his face had arrived at a place beyond the vocabulary of grievance, and what remained there was something quieter and more permanent. And my brother Vivian was standing with his arms at his sides, and his careful composure was entirely gone. And what had replaced it was the particular stillness of a person who has just watched the last door in a corridor close and understood that they built the corridor themselves, and the two lawyers exchanged something between them that was not quite a look and not quite a decision, but functioned as both. And the federal security escorts entered the suite at my assistant's signal and crossed the pale floor and took their positions. And the senior escort said what needed to be said in the professional and minimal way that federal escorts say necessary things. And the group began moving toward the suite door, and I did not stand, and I did not speak. And my brother Vivian passed through the door without turning back, and my father paused for a fraction of a second in the door frame, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I held his gaze with the same expression I had been holding since I turned the chair around, which was the expression of a senior director observing the conclusion of a federal process. And then he walked through the door, and my assistant closed it, and the acoustic silence of the suite returned to its full and complete quality. And I turned my chair back toward the glass wall, and I let the city be what it always is. Over the following 3 months, the automated enforcement infrastructure processed the asset recovery procedure attached to the criminal prosecution referral with the mechanical consistency that federal financial systems are built to maintain. And my father's corporate asset portfolio was formally assessed by the Enforcement Division's Independent Valuation Unit, and a liquidation order was issued covering the full assessed value of the illegally diverted company interests, plus the statutory penalty structure that compounds from the date of the original fraudulent act, which was 17 days before I returned from my overseas assignment, and the compounding penalty calculation applied to the base value of the holding company's registered asset portfolio produced a total recovery figure that consumed my father's corporate holdings entirely and extended into his personal home equity layer. And the liquidation proceeded through the standard enforcement schedule without pause and without negotiation. And when it concluded, the outcome was filed as a matter of permanent public record in accordance with the regulations governing cross-border corporate fraud cases of this classification. And my brother Vivian's global directorship profile remained blacklisted across all 39 affiliated jurisdictions. And every professional licensing body that had received the automated suspension notice maintained that suspension without reversal, because the Level 1 identity theft marker attached to his registered identity does not lift until the prosecution process reaches its conclusion, and the prosecution process was nowhere near its conclusion. In the weeks that followed, my father attempted to reach me through a sequence of intermediaries, and the intermediaries included 2 former business partners who had worked with the family company in its earlier years, and 1 distant relative from my father's side of the family, and a corporate lawyer who had not been present at Wednesday's meeting, and who had been given an account of events that omitted most of the documented facts. And each of these people contacted my office block, and each contact was received by my assistant and logged and routed without exception to the standard 30-day administrative review portal, and the portal issued an automated acknowledgement to each sender and produced nothing further, and the attempts continued for approximately 5 weeks. And then they stopped, and I noted when they stopped, and I made no further record of it. I had already begun the administrative process of separating every layer of my professional and personal existence from the registered contact infrastructure of my family, and I submitted a formal co-director reinstatement application to the authority's internal corporate registry under my verified senior director identity credentials. And the reinstatement was processed within 8 working days, and my name was restored to the founding charter as sole executive director because my brother Vivian's fraudulent registration had been dissolved by the prosecution referral. And there was no other name to occupy the position. And I updated my international passport correspondence records and my financial account registrations and my emergency contact designations and my residential address filing and every professional profile connected to my senior director credentials. And each update was clean and administrative and required no conversation with anyone and cost me nothing except the time it takes to correct something that should never have been altered. On a Thursday evening, approximately 3 months after Wednesday, I was standing on the narrow balcony outside my executive suite, and it was raining, and the city below was the same city it always is at that hour, which is lit and gray and moving at its own pace, entirely independent of the specific weight of any individual life resolving itself above it. And I was holding my phone in my right hand with the screen facing upward, and the screen was completely clean, and there were 0 notifications and no calls pending and no messages in any queue and no intermediaries positioned between me and the silence. And I stood on the balcony and I looked at the clean screen, and I thought about the word concrete and what it means in the structural sense, which is a material that is load-bearing and dense and formed under pressure and resistant to forces that would fracture lighter compositions. And I had been the concrete foundation of a corporate structure that my father had decorated with glass and celebrated the glass and promoted the glass and attempted to remove the concrete quietly while the concrete was overseas, doing the work that had earned the building its standing in the first place. And the glass had believed that the light it caught belonged to it. And the federal enforcement system had introduced the glass to the concept of load-bearing consequence, and the glass had not survived the introduction. And I was still standing, and the rain was falling on the stone railing in front of me with a sound that was small and consistent, and my phone was clean, and the offshore registry pipeline was completely clear. And I went back inside and closed the balcony door behind me and sat down at my desk and opened the preparation file for Thursday and began to read.